Proper preparation for your raised beds and your garden as a whole in spring can really set you up for success throughout the gardening season. Join me as I show you some of the factors that I consider and how I prepare my beds. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and it's early spring in my garden. I've been working on cleaning up a lot of my landscape, but now it's time to focus on my raised beds that are part of my vegetable garden. It's about a month before my last frost date, which means for me, it's about 6 weeks before I plan to put a lot of plants in these beds. So now is the perfect time to start thinking about getting the soil and the beds ready to go. The first thing I do in spring, even before I start thinking about the soil and the plants, is to inspect the beds to see if there's any that are damaged and need to be repaired. I strongly suggest that you repair your beds before you start digging in it and putting in any soil amendments in spring. With the beds fixed, ready to go, then you can focus on the rest of it. Now, this is a new garden space for me, and so these beds are between a year and a half old. They're beginning to show a few cracks, a little wear and tear, but in my garden, I don't need to replace any of these boards yet. I really don't need to think about fixing any of these beds, but it is an important first step that you should consider in your garden. The next consideration is to clean your garden beds early in spring. Now, most of these beds I prepared in the fall, and one reason why I like to do fall prep and fall amending is because when spring comes, there really isn't much work to do on most of these beds. But I did save this one for spring prep, and I'll show you how I take care of that. And the beds behind me where I have my perennials, I have a bed of horseradish and I have a bed of mint. I've got my asparagus bed, and then behind that I've got some currants and some comfrey and some rhubarb. And I went ahead and cleaned up those beds by cutting down all of the stems and branches and just getting the plants ready for springtime. I have other videos where I show how I take care of the spring cleanup through most of the landscape, and I'll go ahead and put links to those videos in the description below. But today, with the focus on vegetable gardens and raised beds in particular, let's start looking at this bed. Now, this bed grew beets and carrots and a number of other plants last year, and some of those still remain in the ground. And because I didn't have a mulch over it during the winter, some weeds have sprouted. Now it's time to take care of those roots that are still in the ground and these weeds. Generally, if the soil is rich and ready to go and needs minimal amending, I would just come in and go ahead and dig out all of these leaves. And so the cleanup on most of your beds might be pretty easy. It might be a simple matter of pulling up some of these spinach plants that popped up from the extra seed I had, or maybe digging up some of the weeds. And the bed is cleaned and all ready to go. If it's already amended soil and you just need cleanup, it's as simple as this. But if the bed requires more cleanup, like the one I just showed you and this next one, there's a lot more to it. And so with beds like these that have weeds and a lot more plants popping up, I could get down and dig them out individually, but this is my tool of choice, a garden fork, because I can get in and just turn over the soil, and all those plants are now incorporated as more organic matter. For a bed that is pretty well amended, just a quick turn like this will put some of that material back in. It'll aerate the soil so that the soil microorganisms can get to work decomposing this material, and it's pretty quick work. But I do want to also add some more organic matter to this soil. And like that other bed with the beets, where I'll be adding more organic matter as well, I'm using compost. The idea of this, just like turning over the soil with these little plants, is to spread a layer of compost on the soil. And I'm really going to kill two birds with one stone, because I could turn over all these plants and then come back and do the compost, but instead I'm going to spread the compost on the surface. And then as I turn all of these plants into the ground, well, the compost will be turned in at the same time. For soil that is in pretty good shape, and I just filled this bed last year, so the soil still has some good organic matter in it, I'll just spread an inch, maybe 2 of the compost at this point. And this is what I'm going to turn in to amend this bed as part of my springtime prep. But for newer beds that are just starting out, or old beds that haven't been amended in a while, I would encourage that you use 3 to 4 inches of compost. 25% is really what you're looking for. So if you can get 3 to 4 inches of compost and then work that into the top 12 inches, that's ideal for a brand new bed or one that really needs to be rejuvenated. But for a bed like this that's in good shape, just an inch or 2 of compost is enough. If you know that your soil is very rich and packed with nutrients and you're practicing no-dig gardening, you would actually stop right now and just put the 2 inches of compost down as a top layer and move on to other beds. This is the end of your spring prep, but this is just my second year and the soil is not that great yet, so I do want to incorporate it. And so it's a simple matter of just digging in and then turning over the soil so that this compost is incorporated closer to root level and so that I dig up some of these weeds in the process. And you can see that some of these weeds are coming to the surface. I'm just going to leave them in place. They'll break down, but in the short term, they'll actually act as a little bit of mulch and food for soil organisms. After I get this bed completely turned over, there's another critical step as well. By turning this compost into the soil, it's all resting low down. And so what I've brought up to the top is potentially unamended soil. So after this is all turned, I'll go ahead and roll it a little bit and then top it with another inch or 2 of compost. That'll be the icing on the cake, so to speak. And basically at that point, with just that compost on the surface, it's essentially a no-dig bed. And it's not just weeds or volunteer spinach plants that you want to turn into your soil. If you grew a cover crop, well, the benefit of that cover crop might come from reincorporating it into your soil. And that's what I did in this bed. I grew winter rye, beginning in the fall through the winter, and now in the spring, I've turned those plants back into the soil, just like I showed you, to get all of that benefit, to get all of those organic materials in the soil so that the soil organisms can begin to break it down and release all of the nutrients. After the winter rye seedlings emerged last fall, I went ahead and mulched this area with straw. One of the reasons I like using straw is because of springtime. When I turn over the soil, that straw also gets incorporated as additional organic matter, and it decomposes pretty quickly. After I finished turning over the soil in the bed, I went ahead and added more compost, and then I just spread it out to get that even layer, 1 to 2 inches thick. I follow that same basic process for my perennial raised beds, like this asparagus bed. I've mulched with leaves and that straw over the course of last year. Now, I'll go ahead and add a light layer of compost on top of the straw, crushed leaves, and the little bit of asparagus that remain. And I'll spread this as well. The idea is that we're adding organic matter to the top because these perennial plants can't be dug up and we can't mix the soil. It's more difficult to add organic matter, but by adding it to the surface, we can go ahead and build the soil from above. And by coating with compost, that straw and those crushed leaves I was using as a mulch, that will also decompose and enrich the soil. And I'll follow the same basic process with my green stock vertical growing system. I don't need to replace the soil that's in here. I just need to augment it with more organic material. So I'll add more compost and potting soil to bring up the level of each of these layers before I plant again. I do have a decision to make about these beds that I amended last autumn. They've been sitting here for about 7 months, and I could add another inch or 2 of compost. But most of that time, this ground was frozen or covered with snow, so there hasn't been a lot of decomposition of the organic matter. So I'm not going to amend these beds today. I'll probably wait till the end of the season and do everything again in the fall to make this spring process much easier. And so I'm happy with the organic content of the soil in all of my raised beds. And now it's time to cover that soil. So I'll start with my straw and spread it all over the beds. And as I said, I like straw because it can become additional organic matter. But at this point, it's important to mulch the surface because, one, there's going to be a lot of earthworms close to the surface, and I don't want robins eating my worms. But two, we really need to protect the soil surface from the harmful rays of the sun. And also, as it rains and snows yet again for the next 6 weeks, any moisture that is added to the soil should stay within the soil. And the mulch helps keep that soil pretty consistent as far as moisture is concerned. So I'll spread straw on all of these beds in the spring because I had a lot of straw blow off, and I've got some bags behind me that are filled with crushed leaves, and I'll spread that as well. And so with the soil amended and the mulch in place, these beds will sit for about 4 to 6 weeks before I put any seeds or plants in them. And I like that as a minimum. I actually prefer to have 6 to 8 weeks if I can. That gives time for all those soil organisms to begin incorporating all of this fresh organic matter that I worked into the soil. If you do it much earlier than that, well, then you might run into some issues with nitrogen depletion of the soil as that organic material starts to break down. But with 6 to 8 weeks, that should be ample amount of time. I was delayed because of snowstorms and because my soil has been so cold. You don't want to work when the soil is really wet or saturated. It can really break apart the structure of the soil. And you don't want to work in soil that's frozen for the same reason. So I needed to allow time for my beds to thaw out and drain a little bit, and then I worked when the soil was nice and moist, as you probably saw. That's the ideal time to work. Not when it's dry, not when it's wet, but when it's moist. And those soil organisms can get to work right away on all of that organic matter. There are some additional considerations as well. The mulch also cuts down on weeds. And so that freshly turned soil that's nice and loose and rich is ideal for weed seeds. With mulch in place, we help cut that down as much as possible. And I would also normally water all of the beds right now to help settle the soil and the mulch on top of it. But I'm expecting rain tonight and tomorrow, so I'm going to bypass that step. But I would have shown that if I wasn't expecting rain. Finish this off with a good watering. And you might be wondering why I didn't mulch that bed and that bed. Well, that's because I have seeds already sown in that bed and the seedlings are just beginning to emerge. So I'll wait till they get a little bit bigger before I mulch and get the benefits of mulch in that bed. And in this bed over here, I anticipate sowing seeds in this next coming week. So in a few weeks, all of these beds will be mulched going into the season. And I'll be tracking the progress of the beds and all of the plants throughout the growing season. There are many more videos to come. So if you haven't subscribed to the Gardener Scott channel, I encourage you to do so right now. And make sure you click on the bell so you know when those videos are coming out every week. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.